right? And that, and how we saw like how we can like look at it from a scientific standpoint versus like a cultural standpoint. It's like how like we as scientists would see it as, there was a tumor causing gigantism inside Goliath, and that's why he's so big, and why he was defeated in the first place because he had that blind spot because of the tumor was pressing on his well on his brain. And then how we'd see it as coming from a cultural standpoint where it's like oh well it's a story of morality to show how stepping up how we can step up to, sorry I'm sorry how we can step up to actually fight bigger things, challenges in life.
Excellent. Any other first impressions before we kind of dig into the meat? So the first thing is I want you guys to feel like complete freedom to dive in with any thoughts that you may have. Generally speaking, it's a really boring listening to me talk. Ask any of my students. I probably talk way too much for my own good. So this is something that's much more interesting when we kind of have and just kind of throw our different ideas just sort of out on the floor, because a lot of times this is less kind of like a traditional kind of a instructor student sort of a thing, and it's kind of more of like a group learning process. Matter of fact, you guys learn a lot more from each other than you ever will from me. That's for sure.
And I just want to highlight there are no wrong answers or wrong, just really all your perceptions. And this is really a good space to really start to get your ideas out there, kind of hash them out, really be receptive to what other people are saying. This is what happens when you get into research and when you start working with collaborative groups. Get your voice out there, listen to other people, and then that's how the dialogue and the conversation and the really creative ideas come out. So please don't be shy.
Yeah, the more vocal, the better.
I think I did have one question come up when I was reading through the paradigms reading. So I felt like the distinction with positivism was pretty obvious to me, like how that's different from critical theory or interpretivism. But with interpretivism and critical theory, I was kind of trying to understand the distinction between those two because it seems like both sort of believe that our reality is shaped by social constructs or factors socially and culturally. So I guess I'm still trying to kind of understand the distinction between interpretivism and critical theory, because it almost seemed kind of like critical theory was like almost a subset of interpretivism the way I was reading it. But I'm wondering if you all could kind of explain the differences there.
Sure. They're certainly related, obviously. I mean, when you take a look at them, obviously positivism stands way out. I mean, it's like the outlier. I think these two, if you think about it in terms of like more kind of conventional lingo, like what maybe Joe Average would probably recognize is we have the kind of the modernist and the postmodernist kind of an idea. And so positivism would definitely be in a modernist type of a field, and the others would be in a postmodern type of a field. But when you're taking a look at the nuances between interpretivism and critical theory, they are very similar. Critical theory is a little bit different in the sense that it's a little more, how shall I say, edgy. It's a little bit more in kind of focused on persuasiveness and change, right? So whereas interpretivism is a little bit more passive, it's a little bit more kind of just knowledge for knowledge's sake, whereas critical theory kind of has a bit more of an edge. Like you develop the knowledge, but with the intention of changing things and changing society. And that's kind of the biggest like the biggest landmark. You're right. They're both kind of founded on the same foundation. The idea that truth, if you will, is a collective thing that's molded and shaped by society, and it kind of is a construct of what each cultural and each society kind of creates. So it's kind of like dependent on the individuals. And with interpretivism, it kind of stops there. And then with critical theory, it kind of moves forward and says, well, wait a minute, if all of these constructs are socially created, then we can socially change them as well. So if we don't like what we see currently in culture, then critical theory kind of goes to the next step and says, well, if we created all of it, then we can decreate it and create something different. And that's kind of the edge that critical theory tends to have. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, and that makes sense with the whole sort of, they mention kind of this advocacy piece in critical theory, so that totally makes sense to me now.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Any other first thoughts? Okay. So what I want to do is I want to, because we're reading a lot of stuff. I mean, it's a great paper. Probably my guess is those of you STEM folks, because technically Foundations is not just STEM, it's just scholarship in general. So that would also be non-STEM individuals as well. Dr. Niemeyer is a STEM person, as are me and Christy. We are both STEM people. And so we kind of have the STEMish blinders on. And so I want to sort of back up a little bit and to sort of neutralize a few things and sort of set a framework that sort of helps us to understand why we're doing what we're doing. I mean, obviously, we're all here. Some of us are very STEMish. I know we at least have a couple of biochemists in the crowd. And I know because molecular and biochem was my thing. And when I saw things like this, I was all like, what? Why are we even bothering to wasting our time with all of this? So don't worry if that's what you're thinking. Been there, done that. I know exactly where you are. So what I want to do for you is I want to basically kind of set the framework, a couple of major themes that we have actually going throughout the class that kind of helps you put the class in perspective, right? So what we focus on, like we mentioned last time, was the building blocks, the foundational building blocks of research itself, not just for STEM, but also just general scholarship for non-STEM as well. And one of the things that we have to do this semester, and I mentioned it last time, and I'm going to keep mentioning it, and I'll have no problem mentioning it over and over and over again like a broken record, is one of our goals is to deconstruct you as a well-trained student. Because typically well-trained students and well-trained scholars are two different types of training. Typically, as a student, we train you to consume information and barf it all out at us. And that's what it feels like on an exam, like you just went through a purge, right? But the problem is we expect you to hang on to that knowledge and just basically repeat it as if we're just kind of training you to do tricks, like a dog training to do tricks. And that's kind of what it's like to be a student. Trust me. I mean, I've been there. So I've been, and I still am in a lot of ways, the dog sitting on command and barking on command. But here's the thing. We train you to do that, but in scholarship, it's a little less traditional student psychology and a little different. You kind of have to sort of get into a different frame of mind because there aren't answers out there for you to repeat back to us. And that's the critical difference when we take a look at scholarship, is there aren't answers out there. We have to go find them. And we have to research them and discover them. They're not just given to us in a book. That's kind of the idea of research. We'll talk a little bit about this in the weeks to come when we start talking about ignorance and knowledge, right? So kind of that, and ignorance in a positive sense, not ignorance in terms of like you don't know anything, but ignorance is like, this is where you don't know. You just don't know the answer. And that's fair. And so we'll take a look at that a little bit deeper, but that's one goal. We have to kind of deconstruct you as thinking like a student and reconstruct you as a scholar, an inquisitive, curious, motivated, critical thinker who's an independent learner. That's all true of scholars and anybody who's doing research. And the other thing that we have to train you on that journey, which is kind of the thesis that sets down what we've been looking at, the sources we've been looking at for this time around, is bias control, right? That's why, if you're wondering, why are we reading a paper about paradigms, right? Why are we looking at videos about worldviews? It kind of makes you feel like you're in a sociology class. Yes? For those of you taking sociology. And if you've taken sociology, you may not have liked it. I remember those were the sorts of classes when I was an undergrad that I was not thrilled at taking. So the question is, why are we looking at this? And it boils down to this: bias control. Because when you're looking at scholarship, when you're trying to answer a question critically, when you're trying to do research to answer a specific question, and this kind of ties also into ethics as well, there is a way that you do it. And the way that you do it has got to be intellectually honest and objective. And that requires us to control our biases. And so really what we're doing with these papers is we're basically taking a look at the different constructs that tend to generate our biases. Now, I don't want to sit here and say that a bias is a bad thing, right? A bias is what it is. And so the reason why this is an important discussion to have at the beginning, especially now, is because even more now than ever before, we live in a society where typically opinions come cheap and largely control the narrative. And opinions are basically bite-sized tweets that are extensions of a deeper bias. Now, that all kind of sounds very bad, right? But I don't mean to cast that in a bad light, because we all have our biases. I've got mine, you've got yours, right? We all have them. And it's not a bad thing. But when we're trying to do an inspection or some sort of a scholarly view of things that's not biased, that's objective, then we have to control our biases, right? Because if you recall from the paper, when you're looking at positivism, you can think of especially scientific research as sort of the quest for truth. But that quest for truth has a powerful assumption that the truth is knowable and it's discrete, right? Like in science, it's like the world is what it is. Done, right? It is what it is. It's like 2 + 2 = 4. That is what it is, right? So that's kind of, you have to be kind of objective about that. And so when we take a look at society, which is really difficult, it sounds easy, but it's actually extremely difficult, because typically we tend to sort of operate from our biases. We tend to associate with others who share the same biases, and we tend to form our senses of kind of like and dislike, like I like that person, or like I hate that person. Oftentimes that breaks down to whether or not they share our biases and our opinions, especially in a divisive society like we have today, which is more divisive than it has been in recent memory. So that's kind of the idea, right? So when you're doing scholarship, it's like being biased and having opinions is just part of being a human being. And that's the struggle, is how to do objective studies and not allow your humanity to shade or shadow or color your results and your interpretations. So that's kind of the idea of what we're looking at. Does that make sense? All of a sudden, it doesn't sound so sociological, perhaps? Okay. Somebody tell me what a worldview is.
Okay, this is kind of before we get into getting into what a worldview is, I wanted to ask a quick question because that little snippet kind of sparked something.
Mhm.
When looking at academia and scholarship, especially within, again, going to maybe one of my biases, which is the STEM field, there's a lot of big, like, journals. I think science, I think nature, and those kind of things. And a lot of the time, those, if you get into that kind of not article, journal, they're like, that's the top. When I think of where you want to be, that's where you want to be. But at the same time, with those like journals controlling a lot of the different, like, yes, they have different parts of science that are in it, but at the same time, it's the same journal. So is there basically kind of what I wanted to say or like insinuate is that there's inherent bias even just in scholarly research in articles and stuff. So how is there something that we can mitigate that bias that we see or find a way to help ourselves identify it inherently?
Great question. Anybody got an answer?
That's a that is a great question. And I don't think I really have an answer, but I do want to also add on to that, or I guess expand on that a little bit. That how academia and the scholarship can also perpetuate the same sorts of ideas and can lead toward to decrease in diversity, because you often see in certain fields like there are 2 or 3 really big names in that field. And then though their students become really marketable because they work with these really big names. So then they get the jobs and then they get the positions, they get the funding, and then they have students. So it's basically kind of built from this whole very insular small group that because of the name recognition, you get, I'm saying this really clearly, but you get kind of limited in of diversity and you get a lot of kind of the same ideas. So it gets perpetuated in ways not only with the journals, but kind of tied to that with where you have these big names. They're the ones that get published in those big journals, and then their students benefit from that and they get the job. So it's I don't know, I guess scholarly nepotism in a way. So yeah, that's not really an answer, but it's just wanted you to think about that in also a really a different way.
So, any other thoughts on that one? Because I want to leave ample space for anybody to chime in, or if you have like a chat question, just rifle it through the chat because I've got the chat window up here. So, Skylar, that was an uncanny and a very adept way of putting your finger on a nerve. And you're absolutely right. It's a problem because there's clearly a pecking order in research. I mean, I hate to say that, but the culture of research clearly has its own worldview, if you will, in a sense. And I mean, Christy's right. I mean, going through grad school, I even actually advise my students when I'm mentoring them that they want to always keep in mind not just good work, but also kind of be a little bit of a how should we say politely, a bit of a networker, right? I mean, if you can hook up with a Boulder Lab or something like that, somebody like a Tom Cech who's a Nobel laureate, then absolutely take that opportunity because you're going to get that name recognition behind you. And kind of what kind of going off what Christy said is that I actually, what she was talking about was a beneficiary of exactly that sort of name recognition nepotism that you see. Because when I was going to my PhD program, I got accepted to Case Western, but because there was a professor there who knew the professor that I worked for as an undergrad, Scott Hawley, who's now in the Academy of Sciences. But just by Scott's name recognition, this one professor at Case Western took me out to dinner and literally asked me, I mean, verbatim, it's not overspeak, it's like literally verbatim, what do I have to do to get you to come here? I mean, that's literally what he said. I mean, so that was like just purely based on Scott's name recognition. And you're right, Skylar. There is clearly a pecking order of journals. Nature and Science, Art, and Cell, those are the biggies, right? That's what every PI is trying to get themselves published into, because that's considered not just a publication, but it's considered a high quality publication. And typically for tenure, they look at both a lot of times in these big research institutions, not just are you publishing your research, but are you publishing your research in high quality journals like Cell and Science and Nature? Typically the idea and the understanding is if you're publishing there, you're kind of part of the national group that is like the who's who of that particular field. It's even worse actually than what you actually mentioned, Scott, because there's actually a very small number of people on the editorial boards of these magazines that all typically know each other, and they basically all make the decisions on who gets to actually publish in those journals. So yes, you're right. There is a very small and disturbingly small number of people that control the narrative. So how is that not bias? It is. And that's the problem. There's bias in ourselves, right? And that's one we can control. But then there's also industrial bias in the industry as well. Eden, you had your hand up?
Yeah. I just wanted to like talk about it, I guess, or say something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I understand the whole question right, but I agree. I think there is bias, but I also feel like sometimes like when I was in one of my like rotations for a lab, they would like do journal clubs and they would like pick apart the articles and be like, oh, they messed up here. Like this is bad. We should reach out to them and like this is a terrible decision. Why did they do this? All that. And then also even in my last lab, I think they were talking about how some like Cambridge level lab, whatever, was reading their paper and also reached out to them saying like, hey, you guys messed up here. You didn't label it right or whatever. Um, I don't know if this like is what will eliminate bias, but I feel like labs doing that helps get rid of like yeah, like Nature can like prioritize publishing maybe like a bad paper because they know the guy that runs this lab and there's bias there, but like other labs will read it and be like, this is a terrible paper, you guys should take it down. So I'm not saying that like there's no bias, but I feel like that's one of the ways that we can like at least eliminate it. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's addressing the question that Skylar had. But yeah, that's just what I have seen in my short amount of time in this.
I think that's a good point, Eden. I think calling out when there's obvious problems is important. I think we see it more now than we think we might have a few decades ago. Especially like I in things that are I think we've seen letters to editor about when things are calling out bad behavior, and not just scholarly bad behavior, but like, you know, misogyny or sexism. We've seen that happening. So yeah, I think that is one way to address that. More people calling out bad behavior and just not going with it because of the big names. So
Skylar, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of really quickly kind of address both what Eden said, what Dr. Duran said, what you have said is yes, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that inherent, like there is a huge pecking order. And there's also something in research, because I took an ethics and research kind of course already. And one of the cases we talked about is, this was actually a really huge scandal, is that there was a Alzheimer's research paper that was published, and the problem was is everybody kept trying to follow this procedure because it was really huge. It was a quote unquote a breakthrough. But the problem was is the dude kind of just skimmed in there because he knew people, or they were like, oh yeah, that's so cool. This is, or they prioritized the quote unquote like breakthrough over the authenticity because nobody could recreate his experiment. And so it caused a huge distrust in like the scholarly world automatically because of the bias there that like they're like, oh yes, a breakthrough, and they prioritized either the breakthrough or he knew somebody in order to get himself published, and it turned out to be completely fabricated. So when kind of like Eden said, discussing or going through and really criticizing articles is something I feel like it can help, but there's also the time piece because it took over 14 years for that article to be discredited.
Mhm.
So and yes, academia already is like a slow moving process. I feel like bias is very inherent and it's something that we should look at. But I don't even really know where to start in the academic world to kind of get at it. Because even we also talked about the fact that professors from like, or people educated at Harvard were usually who were hired at professors or hired at different universities as professors. And then the biases that they inherited from Harvard get passed down completely through all the different organizations that they become a part of. And I don't know. I just wanted to bring it up, put attention on it, because I haven't heard a lot of people in the academic world talk about it because we're more focused on like, oh, this is what I did. This is so cool. Instead of like, hey, what this person did isn't awesome. We should probably address that before we go further. So yeah, that's it.
Eden, your hands up.
Yeah. I just thought of something else. In my last lab, Dr. Wren, who's the PI, he was talking about how like there's bias for like undergraduates or graduates getting hired like into labs or being admitted into labs. And he was talking about how like I think he was saying like an undergrad might be prioritized more if they're from Harvard or MIT or whatever. Um, not all the time, right? But like sometimes. But then he was like, once it gets into like postdoc stuff or like PhD level stuff, it's more about like what you published is what they're looking at. Or at least he was saying kind of like if it's a good lab, they're not going to care where you come from. They're going to care about the quality and the quantity of your work, which I guess in a way is bias. But like you said, I would think it's a good bias, right? Like you want to have someone that's getting good papers published. So I feel like there are already PIs that are probably thinking about that and know that. And I feel like a good PI isn't going to care where you're coming from as long as you have like probably the work to back it up or whatever it is. Again, I don't really know much, but I just thought about that because we were having that conversation where we were talking about like nepotism and how like it is a privilege to be a researcher because some people need to make money, right? And there's already like that privilege of being able to pursue research and stuff like that. But I think I really liked what he was saying was like, you know, if it's a good lab, they're not going to care if you graduated from CU Anschutz or whatever, as long as your work is good.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say that CU Anschutz is a big deal. So coming from CU Anschutz is not like, Hobunk University in nowhere, USA. CU Anschutz is probably, I would put it for the biomedical field, is toe to toe with Boulder. And in some cases, it puts Boulder on the ground. So they don't quite have the number of Nobel laureates that Boulder has, but they're the best kept secret in Colorado. As a grad school, a couple of things that from the discourse going back and forth. So Skylar, when I said you put your finger on the nerve, that was exactly what I meant, right? Because what you identified was basically a problem in the industry that everybody in the industry is struggling with and that nobody really has answers to. A couple of things, first of all, that emerged. number one, Eden, you just described a process in research that is there, peer review, right? So that idea of taking somebody's paper and critically reading it as an antagonist, as a devil's advocate, if you will, and kind of tearing apart their data and basically not listening to their story or to who they are, but saying, is what you're saying actually what your data is telling us? And that's what journal clubs are for. It's basically to tear that data apart. It does two things. First of all, it allows you as a student to digest and internalize that data and to understand it better. And it teaches you how to do good science. The other one is it also trains you to basically spot a lie, or how should we say, a misrepresentation, right? Lie's a little strong. that implies intent, but sometimes there is intent, and that's kind of where biases come in, right? And so that is a key piece that you're talking about. That's part of the bias control. That's why we have peer review and discourse and discussion and things like that. But there still is a problem, right? Because as Skylar mentioned, it took 14 years for this paper to kind of fix its way. And in a lot of ways, you guys are hitting, and what you're kind of looking at and what you're kind of hitting is something that I hammer my students in general bio like mercilessly from the beginning of class till the very end, because I'm a bit of a scientific purist. And so I don't like intermixing of a lot of different extraneous sorts of things coming in and polluting science, because science kind of has to keep its focus front and center. The one major thing you do in science is always maintain your objectivity. I always tell my students, if you do nothing else in science, always maintain your objectivity. And typically I have a phrase that I always tell them that basically in science, never fall in love with your idea. Because the moment you fall in love with your idea or your hypothesis or your explanation for the data, the moment you fall in love with it, you cease to be a scientist and you've become an advocate. And advocates are not scientific, because it's not your opinion or your worldview that drives the interpretation. It's the data that drives the interpretation. And you have to be objective. So the thing of beauty that you created, like that Alzheimer's paper, which was a thing of beauty, you have to be willing to tear that all apart and to destroy it. Take the sledgehammer to it if new data comes in that contradicts that idea and says, yeah, you know what? You said that 2 + 2 = 5. Yeah, and we went with that. It sounded great. 5 is a nice number. It looks good, right? But we've got data that suggests that it's not 5, that 2 + 2 is actually 4. So you have to be objective enough to come back to your theory and say, you know what? I took a good look, a critical look, peer review, at your data. And yes, clearly 2 + 2 does not equal 5. I have to go back to the drawing board, rework my idea, and then retest. So that sense of changing your theory in the context of new data that contradicts your theory is a critical point in science. And part of the problem is, I would argue, especially when you're taking a look at Alzheimer's, there is a lot of motivation behind that probably leads professors down that pathway of non-objectivity. At some point, my guess is that professor wanted to believe that this was true so badly that they were willing to actually try to float that through without appropriate data substantiation. Now, generally in the industry, how we control against that is like when I was in my lab, I mean, there was a lot of experiments that I did, and a lot of it was not publishable. And there was a very high bar for the data that was considered publishable in that lab. And this particular guy's Tom Blumenthal, who is actually, he was a student of Jim Watson of Watson and Crick fame. So he was like looked at in esteem by a lot of people across the country. So he couldn't just put out data. His data had to be like a certain standard and a certain level because he was, a Jim Watson student. And so as a result, a lot of my experiments never got published because I was never actually able to get to that Jim Watson standard. Now, here's the reason why. The reason for that is because I'm not going to put data out there in print that I have to later on retract, because that's going to look negatively on my career. And at some point, my fellow colleagues are going to stop listening to me. And also the tenure committee is going to decide that I'm a quack at some point. Oftentimes, the internal consequences of putting out bad research is, for the most part, supposed to be an internal check on exactly what you're talking about, Skylar. Putting out bad research. Okay. But it's supposed to, you're not supposed to publish that first, right? Something like that's that sensational and that's that exciting. The idea is, yeah, that's a great, prove it. You did it once, do it twice, do it 3 times. Let another lab do it who doesn't like you. If they do it and they get the same thing you got, guess what? You're onto something. Then we'll publish it. That's the way it's supposed to work. But when you fall in love with your idea and you lose your objectivity, you see something as sexy as Alzheimer's coming across your table, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this is going to be really big. This is cover stuff, right? So we can put this one on the cover, and then you print it anyway, even though it's not necessarily as well supported as it ought to be, considering how big the claim was. That's one of the reasons why I always, always, always harp on maintain your objectivity. Never fall in love with your idea. And I know you kind of expressed some concern as where to start in terms of fixing all this. The place you start is right here. This is where it starts. This is where it started, where it is now. What is now started the same way, with students gathering together in a class, talking about their research and learning how to and how not to do their research. That's where it starts. It didn't get here overnight, and it's not going to get fixed overnight. I would argue in terms of the industry, this is another thing that grinds away at me in bias control, is the way we educate the public in science. That Alzheimer's paper is a perfect example. And obviously Sky's probably thinking, whoa, okay, I clearly poked the nerve there. I mean, that's just going on, but this is really critical, right? Because as an industry, I think we are absolutely borderline deceptive when it comes to how we educate the average public. Because what we do is we come out with these discoveries, like your Alzheimer's paper. It's got media appeal to it. I mean, who doesn't want to read about that one, right? And so what do? You call the reporters, you call the media outlets, you put out your discovery. Look, we just cured Alzheimer's. Now the public thinks you just cured Alzheimer's. But then when you kind of all the lights fade and you turn off, and it's time to kind of clean up after the party, and you start doing the hard science of kind of checking this all out and be like, you know what? When I'm running this again, it doesn't work. Then you start to realize that Alzheimer's idea is full of holes. That's not really the way it works at all. And so you then print a retraction. And you see those all the time in journals, right? And so they'll retract that. But guess what? Even though the scientific community now realizes that this was not accurate, and they move on and they try to find the more accurate answer, guess who's still thinking that Alzheimer's been cured? The average public. And when you take a look at the average public's understanding of science, it is full of delusions, half-truths, and deceptive narratives. Because scientists are horrible at doing honest education at that level. Not like this, but at that level. Because they get an idea, they're excited because now they're thinking, I've just cured Alzheimer's. And what they're really thinking is like, I'm going to win a Nobel Prize. That's what they're thinking. So what do? They go out and tell everybody else. Maybe if I let as many people know that I just cured Alzheimer's and I'm going to get the Nobel Prize, then I'll get the Nobel Prize. But guess what they don't do? When it gets corrected, you don't hear them coming out, do you? You don't hear those same scientists coming out like, oh, hey, guess what? You know, that whole cure of Alzheimer's, it's totally bogus. I'm
But
an idiot.
I'd
You
also
don't,
argue,
right? You don't hear them do that.
I'd also argue it's big, a part of it's the media too, right?
Yeah. The media doesn't want to hear what's not. Yeah, they want to hear like, oh, here it is. It's a partnership.
Partnership, yeah, I would
But it
definitely.
all comes down to objectivity and bias control. The reason why we're deceptive in how we're training the public is because we've allowed ourselves as scientists to fall in love with our idea rather than maintain that intellectually disciplined sense of objectivity. That's critical. That make sense?
I really love that don't fall in love with your idea, because I think that's what happens. At least that's what happens with me, with research. I get really very excited and really very passionate about it. And is really easy to get to fall in love with an idea, right? So trying to really maintain that objectivity is really very key, because you can still be really passionate about your research, but being able to really take a hard objective look at the data and what it is and isn't telling you is really foundational, really very important.
Yeah, one of the things that I always tell my students, another thing I always tell them, it's like, I'm not afraid to poke the bear, right? Because sometimes the bear needs to be poked. And I always tell my students, it's like, I actually have a particular way of testing to see if somebody, like a scientist usually, has fallen in love with their idea or if they've maintained their objectivity. You know what I do? I get aggressive with my questioning of them. I start poking at them. Here's your idea. That piece right there, how do you know that's true? Right? What data led you to that particular idea right there? And what alternatives could have been, right? So maybe it was this over here, not that way. So I start poking at them. You know what happens? When you're an objective scientist, you typically welcome those questions because it allows you to be able to think in different ways and consider things that you hadn't considered. And you start thinking, it's like, maybe I could do a couple of experiments to take a look at that and see whether or not that is a viable alternative to my answer, right? I think it's this, but maybe it's this over here. I don't know. I'll do an experiment to figure that out and I'll learn a little bit of something, right? That's what an objective person would do. If you fall in love with your idea, guess what happens? What happens if I took somebody you love and I started attacking them? What would you do? What would your response be?
Get angry.
Yeah, you'd get defensive, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Right? You drop into mama bear mode, right? Be like, okay, don't mess with my people, right? This is my crew. Don't touch them. As soon as I do that to a scientist and I start to see this kind of emotional, visceral response, they fall in love with their idea. Because objectivity does not allow you to get that emotionally worked up. You should be able to say, like, listen, you know what? This is what I think it is, but it could, I don't know, right? So it could be any number of different ways. But once you start getting that visceral emotional response, immediately you've just basically tipped your hand. You've fallen in love because I've attacked the thing that you love and now you're defensive. At that point, usually I just stop listening. It's like, as a scientist, as a scholar, I'm not listening anymore because you've lost your objectivity. And so what you're about ready to say is going to be data mixed with opinion, mixed with bias, mixed with worldview. I like the way I kind of circled that all the way back to worldview again. Took us a while to get there, but these are all important conversations, right? And this is the way the class works. When we hit on a great question like Skylar just asked, I mean, that was, bullseye, first time out, bang, right? I mean, those are like, stop. Let's park it. Let's talk this out because this is a big deal. This is a big issue that we need to talk about, especially in research industry and how to do research, how to conduct research, and things of that nature. So these are big issues that need to take time to talk their way out. Does that make sense? Okay. I feel like I'm still talking. I said I wasn't going to talk, but I'm still talking. I can't help myself. That's what they like pay me to do, right? They just talk. Got any number of words. Connie probably knows this because I had her in a class, so she knows that I probably talk way too much for my own good.
Or maybe we can go back to the question or we went here about the worldview, right? That was the question.
Okay.
What is a worldview?
So, anybody have an answer for what a worldview is?
I would say it kind of reflects like your outlook, your beliefs, your underlying values, and how you conduct your research, how you choose what paradigm you're going to use, what method you're going to use. It affects how you make those decisions. So it's like your feelings about things, kind of, your perspective. But I don't know if that's right.
That's a good way to think about it, right? I think in the video, Dr. Niemeyer, Richard basically kind of scale. I like the way he said it, right? It's a symbolic framework that allows people to sort of make sense of reality and the nature of the world. That's why they call it a worldview, right? And he mentioned several different types, right? The scientific worldview. Then he mentioned religious worldviews. There's several of those. And then philosophical and cultural worldviews. And sometimes those kind of intermix, right? So sometimes there'll be kind of like a cultural, religious sort of fusion kind of a thing going on. But the reason why I mention this is because, first of all, we kind of talk about bias control and we talk about, oh, these all biased people, like, it's an easy thing to do. But remember, part of the challenge of doing research is that we are attempting to do an objective study when we ourselves are inherently biased and kind of prone to our particular worldview, right? So we typically are oftentimes much more subjective in the way we see things. We are very biased and very opinionated. And so that's just being human being. That's just human, right? That's not a bad thing. That's just us being us, right? And so the challenge then is kind of trying to do this study without kind of this intervention of these other aspects of us kind of taking over, right? And it's difficult. And so when we take a look at a scientist who's being less than biased, it's a challenge. We do it all the time in science, by the way. There's any number of places throughout science, good, bad, or indifferent, where people have largely fallen in love with their idea because they don't talk about data anymore. They talk about the story, right? So this happens all the time. But the reason why we come to the worldview is because the worldview is basically the source of all of our biases. That's where our biases come from. That's where our opinions come from. And they tend to sort of define who we are, right? Let me ask you another question. And I know we only have a few minutes. And this actually conversation might be worth kicking forward too as well. I don't know. Because we did that the last time we ran this class. So I think we kind of talked about this idea because it's a big idea. It doesn't just touch on research, but it also touches on how we interact with each other, not just as scholars, but as also as human beings, right? When somebody who has a different worldview than you comes your way, how do you relate with them?
Can you repeat that one more time?
So if somebody with a different worldview than yours, and if you're trying to figure this out, you might want to kind of maybe take a look at the different worldviews, like religious worldviews, cultural worldviews, scientific worldview, philosophical worldviews, and kind of try to get a sense of like, okay, what's my worldview, right? And then if somebody with a different worldview than yours comes your way, how do you tend to relate with them? Okay, Connie, great. Try to listen to them, learn what their perspective is. Skylar,
Staying
right?
open-minded. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so like staying open-minded, like holding on to your own beliefs, but like while still like, listening and like thinking about like, oh, well, that's, possibly a valid point as well, because obviously we're in a clash at times, but there is some, gonna be some common ground.
And Skylar, I like the idea that you led off with, though basically they're a person before anything else, right? Any other thoughts on how you'd relate to them? You know what a good exercise might be, because we're just starting this conversation and it's actually kind of at the end. But it's kind of an important one to have because it's something we want to kind of unpack a little bit. Isabella, excellent. So your Chicago studies, we talk a lot about entering spaces with the intent to learn. Excellent. Good. Yep. Excellent. Yes, I love all that. And so this is an important one to unpack, right? Because we just talked a lot about biases and how biases impact negatively, mostly is what we've been talking about, the scholarly environment and the industry that we're in. But now we just got to the point of like, where do those biases come from? And so I'm thinking maybe to kind of, and Christy obviously chime in, if, is we might want to start the next one off with a worldview discussion to get that more. And I've got an exercise for you guys. In the next 2 weeks, here's what I want you to do. I want you to identify somewhere in the world, could be in the news, could be in your personal life, could be somewhere, where you see an interaction between two different worldviews. What are those worldviews? How do they categorize? So is it a philosophical one, a religious one, a cultural one, a scientific one? Or what are they? And what is the nature of that interaction between those two worldviews? And I think I want each one of you to come up with a scenario where you see an interaction between two different worldviews. And what I want to do is I want to talk out the nature of that interaction, because what's going to happen is, remember, just like Skylar referred to, is we all certainly have our worldviews, but the one thing that we all have powerfully in common is that we're all human beings first. And that trumps everything, right? And so what we want to see then is, what is it like when you have these different worldviews interacting with each other? So that's what I want you guys to do. That's going to be the conversation starter at the beginning. So at the beginning, it's going to be on you guys. So I want you guys to start throwing out your observations on the floor, and we'll kind of take a look at them, and we'll kind of pull those into how that sort of feeds into the nature of research and how we do research.
I like that. I'll also put that, send that out, that prompt out in an email, or put it somewhere on Canvas so that you have that. So for next week, since next week is asynchronous, work on this, but also I think we have for next week, chapter 1 and 2 in the videos. We'll probably only have a chance to finish this discussion and maybe start chapter 1 discussion. So, as we said, this is going to be pretty fluid. It's going to be basically how our discussions go each day. So please do come prepared to discuss, and we do want to hear from all of you. So,
will we be meeting online again?
not next week. We'll be the week after. We'll be meeting online.
Okay, so next week's in person.
No. Next week is asynchronous.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're working on chapter 1 and 2, or I guess chapter 1.
Yeah.
So
the syllabus has 1 and 2. And the plan is to discuss what you work on in the asynchronous, but we're probably not going to get to chapter 2. But right. Yeah. All right. Any questions? All right, well, you have your assignment, and next week you will be doing asynchronous work. You'll be doing the readings of our chapter, or at least chapter 1, if you can get to chapter 2, and the videos for those. And then we will meet 2 weeks from today, same link here at same time, and we'll finish this discussion with the worldview and get to at least chapter 1.
Sounds good.
All right, you guys all have a great weekend.
You as well. Thank you.